December 1941. The Pacific was calm. The skies over the Philippines were blue and quiet. Most American and Filipino soldiers still believed the war was far away, happening in Europe, somewhere beyond the horizon. Then the bombs fell. On December 8th, just hours after Pearl Harbor was attacked, Japanese aircraft roared over Manila and Clark Field. They came in waves, black silhouettes against the sun. Bombs shattered runways. Fighters burned on the ground. Entire squadrons vanished in minutes. The war had come to the Philippines. Within days, Japanese troops poured ashore. They moved fast, ruthless, and confident. American defenses collapsed under the weight of their attack. Filipino units fought bravely, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. The enemy controlled the skies, the sea, and soon, the roads. The U.S. command had no choice. They ordered a retreat. All American and Filipino forces pulled back toward the Bataan Peninsula, a narrow finger of jungle and mountains that jutted into the sea west of Manila. It was supposed to be a temporary stand, just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Those reinforcements never came. By January 1942, more than 80,000 starving, sick, and exhausted soldiers were trapped on Bataan. Supplies ran out. Food was reduced to rice and scraps. Malaria, dysentery, and starvation killed as many men as bullets. Japanese artillery pounded the peninsula day and night. Planes bombed jungle trails. The defenders had nowhere left to go. Among them was a young American officer named Russell Volckmann. He was not famous. He was not powerful. He was not supposed to change history. But he was about to. Volckmann commanded a small group of U.S. and Filipino troops in northern Luzon. He watched as Japanese forces swept south like a storm. Every map showed the same truth: the Philippines were lost. By early April, the Japanese broke through the final defensive lines. Bataan was finished. On April 9, 1942, the order came down. All forces were to surrender. Tens of thousands of soldiers laid down their weapons. They had no idea what was coming. Japanese troops herded the prisoners together and forced them to march north, more than 60 miles under brutal heat, with almost no food or water. Anyone who collapsed was beaten, bayonet, or shot. Thousands died on the road. It would become known as the Bataan Death March. But Russell Volckmann never joined it. When the surrender order reached him, he looked at the men under his command. They were thin, exhausted, and frightened. But they were alive. And he made a decision that would change the war in the Philippines. He refused to surrender. Volckmann knew what the Japanese did to prisoners. He had seen it already: bodies in the roads, villages burned, civilians dragged away. Surrender meant death. So he told his men something radical. "We're not giving up. We're going into the mountains." With a handful of soldiers, Volckmann disappeared into the jungle. They left behind their heavy weapons. They took only rifles, ammunition, and whatever food they could carry. They crossed rivers. They climbed ridges. They slept under trees, soaked by rain and hunted by enemy patrols. Behind them, the Philippines fell into darkness. The Japanese occupation was brutal. Villages were forced to bow to imperial officers. Anyone suspected of helping Americans was tortured or executed. Food was seized. Women were abused. Resistance was crushed wherever it appeared. But in the mountains of northern Luzon, something different was happening. Russell Volckmann was not running. He was building. He knew the Philippines better than the Japanese did. He knew the terrain, the trails, the people. The mountains were full of farmers, hunters, and former Filipino soldiers who had refused to surrender. They were angry. They were afraid. And they were ready to fight. Volckmann began to organize them. He set up hidden camps deep in the jungle. He taught them how to use weapons, how to move silently, how to disappear. He built a network of messengers who carried information between villages. He created supply routes for food and medicine. And most importantly, he gave them something the Japanese could not take: hope. The Japanese believed the Americans were gone, that the Philippines was conquered. They were wrong. In the shadows of the jungle, a war was still being fought. And Russell Volckmann was about to turn a handful of survivors into something the Japanese Empire had never faced before. A secret army. By the time the last American and Filipino forces surrendered on Bataan, the Philippines had fallen into silence. Not the peace of victory, but the silence of fear. Japanese flags hung from government buildings. Imperial troops marched through cities that only weeks before had been filled with American soldiers. Loudspeakers broadcast orders in harsh, unfamiliar voices. Anyone who resisted disappeared. But deep in the northern mountains of Luzon, that silence never reached. Russell Volckmann and his men were still alive. They were hungry. They were hunted. And they were very far from beaten. The jungle became their shield. Volckmann understood something the Japanese did not. The mountains of Luzon were not empty. They were filled with hidden trails, forgotten villages, and people who had lived there for centuries. It was a landscape where a small force could vanish and strike without warning. But surviving in it was brutal. Food was scarce. Malaria stalked every camp. Leeches covered their legs. Weapons rusted in the humidity. Men weakened from hunger and disease. Still, Volckmann refused to let them break apart. Every morning, he gathered his small group and spoke to them. He reminded them why they were there, not for medals, not for glory, but because surrender meant the Japanese would own their lives. Slowly, word spread. Filipino soldiers who had escaped capture came looking for him. Farmers brought rice and sweet potatoes. Young men slipped away from villages at night to join his growing band. Volckmann welcomed them all. He organized them into small units. He assigned leaders. He taught them to move quietly, to fight quickly, and to disappear before the enemy could respond. By late 1942, something remarkable had happened. The Japanese controlled the cities. But Volckmann controlled the mountains. Japanese patrols began to vanish. Supply convoys were ambushed. Bridges were destroyed. Telephone lines were cut. The enemy had no idea who was responsible, only that an invisible force was bleeding them in the shadows. To the villagers, Volckmann became a legend. To the Japanese, he became a ghost. They sent troops into the jungle to hunt him. But every time they marched in, Volckmann's fighters melted away. They knew every ridge, every stream, every hidden path. The jungle was no longer wilderness. It was a battlefield. And the man Japan could not kill was just getting started. By 1943, Russell Volckmann was no longer just a man hiding in the jungle. He was the commander of something far more dangerous. It began quietly, one village at a time. At first, Volckmann's group had been little more than a band of survivors, former soldiers, farmers, and young men who had fled the Japanese occupation. They were brave, but scattered. Many carried old rifles. Some had nothing but knives. But Volckmann saw what they could become. He sent trusted fighters into nearby villages, not to recruit with speeches, but with actions. They delivered stolen Japanese food to starving families. They warned villagers before enemy patrols arrived. They rescued prisoners being moved through the mountains. The people began to trust them. Then they began to join them. A farmer would bring his sons. A former Filipino officer would bring his unit. A village would offer food, shelter, and information. Volckmann created a network. Each village became a node. Each trail became a supply route. Each person became part of something larger. He divided his growing force into guerrilla zones, each with its own commanders, scouts, and fighters. They trained with whatever weapons they could steal: Japanese rifles, captured machine guns, even homemade explosives. The jungle echoed with quiet preparation. By mid-1943, Volckmann commanded tens of thousands of guerrillas. The Japanese had no idea. On their maps, northern Luzon looked pacified. In reality, it was slipping out of their control. The guerrillas struck everywhere. A Japanese convoy would disappear in a mountain pass. A garrison would wake up to find its supply depot burned. An officer would be found dead in his quarters. And then, nothing. No enemy to fight. No base to bomb. No army to destroy. The Japanese grew terrified. They sent troops into the hills, but the jungle swallowed them. Villagers gave false information. Trails led to ambushes. Units vanished. In Tokyo, Commanders could not understand how a defeated American officer had turned an occupied province into a war zone. They only knew one thing: Russell Volckmann had to die. But the man Japan hunted was no longer alone. He had built a hidden army, and it was ready for war. By late 1943, the mountains of northern Luzon had become one of the most dangerous places in the Japanese Empire. Russell Volckmann's secret army now controlled hundreds of miles of jungle, valleys, and mountain passes. The Japanese still flew their flags over cities and towns, but the moment their patrols left the roads, they entered hostile territory. This was no longer survival. This was war. Volckmann trained his fighters to strike like lightning. They would lie in wait for days, watching Japanese units move along narrow jungle trails. Then, at the perfect moment, they would unleash fire from the trees, killing officers and machine gunners before the enemy even knew what was happening. A fight might last 30 seconds. Then the jungle swallowed them again. Japanese convoys bringing food and ammunition to the front lines were especially vulnerable. Guerrilla scouts would count the trucks, track their schedules, and choose ambush sites where escape was impossible. Explosives ripped vehicles apart. Rifle fire cut down survivors. Every destroyed convoy meant fewer supplies for the occupation forces. Every ambush made the Japanese weaker. But the guerrillas did more than attack. They gathered intelligence. Volckmann's fighters watched Japanese troop movements. They recorded the locations of airfields, artillery positions, and supply depots. Messengers ran through the jungle carrying handwritten reports from village to village, building a picture of the enemy's strength. Volckmann kept it all in his head. He was turning a ragged resistance into an organized intelligence network. The Japanese response was brutal. They burned villages suspected of helping the guerrillas. They tortured civilians. They executed hostages. It only made the resistance stronger. For every village destroyed, 2 more joined Volckmann. For every execution, more young men picked up rifles. The occupation was becoming a nightmare. And in the center of it stood one American officer who refused to die. Japan had conquered the Philippines. But they had never conquered Russell Volckmann. By early 1944, Russell Volckmann was no longer just a nuisance to the Japanese occupation forces in the Philippines. He was a threat. Every convoy destroyed, every garrison attacked, every officer killed carried the same invisible signature. Somewhere in the northern mountains of Luzon, an American officer was coordinating a war that the Japanese could not stop. So they decided to make the war personal. Japanese intelligence officers began collecting every rumor, every whispered name, every hint of Volckmann's whereabouts. They interrogated prisoners. They tortured villagers. They offered rewards for information. Then they did something far more dangerous. They put a bounty on his head. Posters appeared in occupied towns with crude sketches of an American officer and promises of food, money, and safety for anyone who betrayed him. The Japanese wanted Volckmann alive if possible, but dead would do. The manhunt began. Special Japanese counter-guerrilla units were formed. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were trained to track, to interrogate, to kill quietly. They moved through the jungle with guides and informants, following trails of rumors that might lead to Volckmann's camps. They never got close. Volckmann had built his movement on one unbreakable rule: never stay in one place. He slept in caves. He slept in mountain huts. He slept under trees. Sometimes he slept in a different location every single night. Only a handful of trusted fighters knew where he was at any given time. Messages were carried by runners who memorized instructions rather than writing them down. When Japanese patrols came close, villagers would light signal fires or ring church bells. Guerrilla scouts would spot enemy movement from ridge lines and send warnings through the jungle. The Japanese were hunting a man who never stood still. But Volckmann was not just running. He was planning. Every Japanese search party, every burned village, every brutal interrogation told him something. He learned how the enemy moved, how they responded, where they were weak. The more they hunted him, the stronger his intelligence network became. Some of the Japanese officers were furious. They were used to crushing resistance quickly. But this enemy did not behave like an army. It behaved like smoke. It was everywhere and nowhere. In the villages, Volckmann became a myth. People whispered that he could not be captured. that the jungle protected him, that the Japanese bullets could not find him. And in a way, it was true. Because Volckmann was no longer just one man. He was a movement. By mid-1944, his guerrilla army numbered over 30,000 fighters. They controlled most of northern Luzon's countryside. Japanese troops were afraid to travel without heavy escorts. Even then, they knew the trees might open fire at any moment. But Volckmann knew something else. The Americans were coming back. He could feel it. And when they did, everything he had built would be tested. By late 1944, Russell Volckmann had built one of the largest guerrilla forces in the history of warfare. But there was one thing he still lacked: a voice. For nearly 3 years, Volckmann had fought a private war in the jungles of the Philippines, cut off from the outside world. He had no contact with the United States. No way to tell anyone that tens of thousands of fighters were still resisting the Japanese from behind enemy lines. To the rest of the world, the Philippines was a conquered land. But Volckmann refused to let that lie continue. Hidden deep in the mountains, his engineers and radio operators assembled a miracle from scrap metal, stolen Japanese parts, and pieces smuggled in by villagers. A radio. If it worked, Volckmann could reach American command in Australia. If it failed, the Japanese would detect the signal and hunt them down. It was one of the most dangerous moments of the war. When the radio crackled to life, Volckmann spoke. And across the ocean, General Douglas MacArthur heard him. For the first time, the U.S. military realized that a massive, organized resistance force still existed inside the Philippines. Volckmann sent troop locations, supply dumps, and Japanese fortifications. America now knew where the enemy was. And the Japanese had no idea their secrets were being handed over. The secret army had become the eyes of the Allied invasion. October 1944. The horizon off the coast of the Philippines darkened. Not with storm clouds, but with ships. Hundreds of them. American battleships, carriers, transports, and destroyers rolled toward the beaches of Leyte in the largest naval invasion in the Pacific. After 3 years of occupation, the United States had come back. For Russell Volckmann, it was the moment everything he had built was meant for. His radio crackled with orders from American command. The invasion was underway. Japanese units were being pulled toward the coast to meet the landing. And that meant their rear was exposed. Volckmann sent out the signal. All across northern Luzon, guerrilla units went to war. They attacked bridges. They ambushed supply columns. They destroyed communication lines. Japanese garrisons were cut off. Reinforcements never arrived. Units were isolated and overwhelmed by fighters they never saw coming. When American forces began pushing inland, they didn't meet a unified Japanese defense. They met chaos. Volckmann's secret army had already torn it apart. For the first time in 3 years, the guerrillas fought openly. They guided American units through jungle paths. They pointed out enemy artillery positions. They led U.S. troops into towns where Japanese forces were waiting. The occupation was collapsing. The man Japan could not kill had finally become visible. And now, he was winning. When the first American soldiers pushed into the mountains of northern Luzon in early 1945, they didn't expect what they found. They expected scattered resistance. They found an army. Men in worn uniforms emerged from the jungle carrying captured Japanese rifles, American weapons that had been hidden since 1942, and flags stitched together by villagers who had waited 3 years to raise them. They marched in organized units. They saluted American officers. They reported enemy positions with the precision of trained intelligence teams. For many U.S. troops, it felt like stepping into a legend. Russell Volckmann stepped out of the forest to meet them. He was thinner, older. His uniform was faded and patched. But he stood like a commander who had never stopped fighting. For 3 years, his army had lived without supply drops, without medical care, and without support. They had survived on rice, stolen weapons, and the loyalty of the Filipino people. Now, finally, the United States had returned. And Volckmann's war was about to end. But first, there was still fighting to do. Japanese forces in northern Luzon were collapsing, but they were not gone. Some units dug into the hills. Others tried to escape south. Many were still heavily armed and dangerous. Volckmann's guerrillas were now working directly with American forces. They acted as scouts, guides, and shock troops. They knew every river crossing, every mountain trail, every hidden bunker the Japanese had built. American artillery followed their directions. American bombers struck the targets they provided. The jungle war that Volckmann had fought alone was now being finished by an entire army. The Japanese tried one last time to capture him. Even as their defenses crumbled, they sent patrols into the mountains, hoping to take out the man who had humiliated them for 3 years. They believed killing Volckmann would shatter the resistance. But it was too late. The resistance was no longer just his. By the spring of 1945, northern Luzon was effectively liberated. Japanese units surrendered in groups, some starving, some wounded, all exhausted. Many had never even realized how large the guerrilla army had been until it stood before them. The man Japan had hunted was now impossible to ignore. Volckmann's forces were officially recognized by the U.S. Army. They were given identification, pay, and military status. The fighters who had lived as ghosts were now soldiers again. For the Filipino people, it was a moment of reckoning. The villages that had hidden guerrillas. The families that had lost sons. The farmers who had fed fighters while risking execution. They had won. And at the center of it all was one American officer who refused to surrender. Russell Volckmann returned to the United States after the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He continued serving in the Army, eventually becoming a general. But he rarely spoke of what he had done. Perhaps because the story was too large, too improbable, too close to legend. But history remembers it. An army defeated, a country occupied, and one man who chose to fight anyway. Japan never killed him, because they never truly found him. And by the time they understood what he had built, it was already too late.